Welcome back. A storm is brewing around the Gauteng Education MEC. Yesterday, a group of white people hanged a picture of a doll with Panyaza Lesufi's face and dressed it in an ANC T-shirt. The party in the province has criticized those involved, saying the MEC and his family have been receiving death threats, and it's all linked to Lesufi's efforts to integrate the province's education system. Lesufi has been embroiled in bitter rows with a number of Afrikaans medium school heads over their refusal to admit English-speaking pupils. The Gauteng ANC is urging Lesufi and the Department of Basic Education to open up cases against the perpetrators. Communications Minister Nomvula Mokonyane has also condemned what she's described as a racist attack. ENCA senior researcher Angelo Fick joins us now to explore this further. Angelo, of course, it was worrying to see those pictures being tweeted yesterday and this morning. The MEC is not happy, but it does raise concerns about racism again in South Africa.
Quite, and what I think was most disturbing for many people about this particular image was that it harked back to, or it echoes, images of lynching. So the idea of burning or hanging up political figures in effigy is not a new idea, nor is it particularly sort of unique to South Africa. Politicians strung up in effigy has a very long history. But in South Africa and any society in which there was kind of racist oppression, the idea of hanging black bodies or effigies of such black bodies in public draw upon a longer history of the hanging of actual human beings for crimes, or in public lynchings in places like the United States and in slavocratic South Africa. And so this is not something to be taken lightly, because this image, however well-meaning or innocent these people who've done it now claim to be, actually circulate in a history of images where this calls upon a far more, should we say, endemic violation of blackness inside white supremacist societies.
I mean, how do you have these people feeling free to actually go outside in public and do something like this and think it's okay?
I can't imagine that it's anything other than ignorance of what the consequence of such a representation would be and what the history of that representation is. We, I think, generally have a very poor understanding in South Africa of what these terms' histories are, what these representations' histories are. So, for example, people who use racist epithets or racist insults often forget what those racist epithets and insults, what histories they come from, and what power relations they imply. Similarly, people who use sexist or homophobic responses often either forget or never learn to know what the histories of those particular words were or what those images reveal, and think that these are just innocent images, and yes, they didn't know what this is. And I think here there is a failure, not of a sort of education department, but of a society to educate its citizens into what I have previously referred to as the denazification of South Africa's public space. Now, denazification happened in Germany at the end of the Second World War, and it was not a complete or particularly efficient process, as those who protested in 1968 pointed out. But in South Africa, there's been very little by way of denazifying our public debate, and some of that has resulted in people being able to create these images and or performances without realizing the kind of history of violation that it relies on. The effigy of a black human being strung up on a pole with a noose is not just an innocent image that circulates in the society as in we don't like this person. It draws on a particular history of lynching and the power to erase black people from social spaces, from political spaces, by killing them. And if people are uncomfortable with images that imply violence, or images that echo or repeat or reiterate violation, they should certainly be uncomfortable with this. And I really think this is a matter, at best, of ignorance, if this is not a matter of willful provocation.
I mean, it looks like it's a matter of pure racism to many. The ANC in the province says it is, Nomvula Mokonyane says it is. And then there are also examples now that because there's been a precedent set with the Vicky Momba case, and she got 2 years behind bars for being racist, that the same should apply when we have instances like this happen so publicly.
So for me, there are two different issues here. I don't find, I mean, it certainly would be, and I would agree that there is a racist impulse behind this particular performance. Whether or not the individuals in this particular issue knew that that is what they were doing is what I think is something worth pursuing. Because I'm not necessarily interested only in a punitive approach, because if you simply have a punitive approach, what you have is a country of prisoners. I'm much more interested in, should people be unrepentant and unwilling to learn and change, then certainly there should be a punitive element. And that is what the judge in the Vicky Momberg case indicated, that there was no desire to, repent or feel sorry for or learn from it. Other people who have done similar things have been willing to learn and be open about this as a learning curve for them. It's a little late to be on this learning curve, but it can still be a learning curve. So instead of just going into these outraged postures, I want to know what is the political productivity of engaging with this representation and the people who made it in order to show up to the rest of South Africa exactly why this is problematic, so that we move beyond simply being outraged and we begin to build a political society, a country that we want to live in which people know what is unacceptable and why it is unacceptable, and feel shame at having the ability to make these representations in all sorts of ways. Because I think outrage is a very nice feeling to have in the immediacy, but it doesn't build a society that you want to live in if you're simply being outraged all the time. Punishment is a useful thing for people who are, recidivists or unrepentant of their actions that violate, the norms of a society that wants to live with human dignity. But immediate punishment all the time is banal. It does not help the society move ahead. It doesn't make us any more interesting as human beings. It doesn't help us to get to learn to know one another and why we feel joy and pain about the things that we do. So I think a first engagement is with these particular human beings who created this particular representation, ask them why they did it, ask them what their beliefs are, engage them on what is wrong with it, and then move to the next step. But the immediate punishment and outrage, that serves a very specific and very small and narrow function. I think as a society we need to engage people, ask them why they believe the things they do, and should they then be unrepentant about their beliefs, by all means, then the punitive element kicks in.
I absolutely agree with you on that approach, Angelo. So where do we start? Where do we start the discussion, and who leads the discussion on this very awkward talk of race in South Africa?
I think that discussion is happening all the time. So we have many people in all sorts of spaces in the Human Rights Commission, in our universities, who have written about, studied this issue, have spoken about it in public, and it is about letting go of things we think we know are true about that we've learnt in the past, and being open to learning new ways of understanding the world. You don't just flush 350 years of colonialism, 50 years of apartheid, white supremacist, Christian nationalist thinking on a day in May, or in April in 1994, as we see in 2018. What we should have is ongoing, long-standing approaches to unlearning what we understand about sex and gender and race and class and geography and nationality and what those things mean. So as we're confronted with the IAAF's approach to Caster Semenya, as we're confronted with Freedom Day and Workers' Day, how we understand poverty and poor people, how we understand blackness and whiteness, who counts as human and who is less human, how we understand men and women, how we approach our understanding to sexual and sexuality differences, and whether or not people are deserving of certain kinds of treatments. This should be up for discussion every day in our society, and in some respects it is. But there are people who can tell us more interesting things because they've actually studied it. And I think the Human Rights Commission plays a crucial role here, and it continues to do a productive role. Academics who study this, people like Melissa Steyn, Christy van der Westhuizen, and Dimitri Erasmus, Pumla Gola, Desiree Lewis at the University of the Western Cape Centre for Women's and Gender Studies, and that entire unit itself. These are all people engaged in the study of these problems that come from our misunderstandings, based in knowledge that we imagine we have that isn't actually up to date with what we know from science and from observation through science. And so I think there is a social conversation that should not necessarily be led only by politicians. Politicians and political organizations should be involved, but they're not best placed to lead this conversation. This is a matter of science and research having spoken to these issues, so maybe it's time for us to listen to what those scientists and researchers have been telling us for almost 100 years about race, about racism, about how to engage it, and not have the kind of dismissive attitude towards that scholarship as some very senior politician, one example being a provincial premier, had about critical race studies, critical race theory, and the study of whiteness.